Hey there, Resume Leslie here, and thank you so much for being here for this Career Tip Tuesday. It is the second Tuesday of the month, which means we have another behind hiring interview for you. For those of you who are used to tuning in and just seeing me, I am excited to announce that I have a new co-host for the Behind Hiring series. This is Niatu Bensi Angel. I am thrilled to have him here, and I will let him introduce himself. Niatu?
Hey, what's going on, everybody? What's up, Leslie? How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm great. How are you?
Awesome. I'm excited. Honestly, a little bit nervous as we were sharing behind the scenes before. I was thinking about when I was a kid. I played soccer from age 6 to 16. And before every game, even though I was a pretty good player, I was still nervous. And that helped me stay on my toes. I think it's because I cared. And so having some of the similar feelings right now, but honestly, just really happy to be here and looking forward to kicking off this great new series with you. As far as my background, I present myself as a holistic career coach for professionals of color. I'm here to help ambitious professionals of color navigate their job search more authentically. And I'm a resume writer. I am a career coach. I'm a LinkedIn optimizer, all those things. Really here to meet people at any point in their search process and help them get to where they want to be. I have training in mental health counseling. I have a master's degree in that, and that is what allows me to have this holistic approach in which I think about the personal, the professional, and the psychological when I support people, and I want to make space for that in all that I do. And that's sort of, who I am, a bit of who I am, a bit of what I bring to the table as far as my coaching perspective. And I'm looking forward to us really just pushing the envelope with our conversations and really bringing important topics to the forefront.
That is awesome, Niatu. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have been a huge fan of yours since the very beginning. I know you and I shared posts last week about this collaboration, and we both had background to share. And I know we had a conversation almost a year ago where I said, I really like you. I would like to collaborate with you, figure out a reason for us to work together. And now we are doing that. I saw somebody in the comments, Simona, she's been a big supporter so far of Career Tip Tuesday. She says hello to both of us, and she says, you got this, Nia, too. So we've got some support in the comments already.
Awesome. Yeah. Hi, Brad. Hi, Hannah. Hi, Laura. A lot of people whose names are familiar in the audience. I appreciate you all being here today.
That is fantastic. For those of you watching, please go ahead and like this video, help it spread to as many job seekers out there as possible. If you're catching the replay, go ahead and comment replay and let us know where you're watching from. Go ahead, and if you're live, let us know where you're watching from as well. The Behind Hiring interview series is all about sharing information from hiring insiders with job seekers. So if you feel like someone in your network could benefit from this conversation we'll have today, please go ahead and share the live as well. That would be super helpful. Before we get into our guest today, I wanted to let you guys know a little bit more about our mission. So the mission of Behind Hiring since the beginning has been really to help job seekers see behind the curtain of the hiring process. And now that Niatu and I are collaborating, we have expanded on that even more. Niatu, do you want to let them know a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I'm thinking about Captain Planet right now. By our powers combined, we're about to make something bigger. And so what we collectively plan to do on this series is to really focus on empowering job seekers. We want to make sure the human element is brought back into the job search process, especially when it comes to hiring, because too many people feel like commodities today in the process of looking for a job, and that needs to end because we can offer far more from the employer side and the job seeker side to create a better experience. DEI is going to be at the core of what we do. Lezlie and I both are incredibly passionate and focused on this issue and making sure we can raise awareness, give practical tools and insights from the guests that we bring on here to make sure that everyone is on board. It's everyone's job to do DEI. And also we want to make sure that job seekers realize they got more power than they've been told that they have.
Yep, that's exactly right. And what we really seek to do is to ask questions of these hiring decision makers and sort of co-conspire for an hour or so in challenging the status quo and brainstorming better solutions for a broken system.
Yeah, and ultimately, we hope to help make the hiring process more equitable. And that's the core of our mission.
Yes, yes, yes. I am so excited about that. So, if you are watching and you are excited about that too, if you support that mission, give us a thumbs up or say hell yeah in the comments and let us know that you are excited about it. Okay, so as we said, the Behind Hiring series is all about interviewing hiring insiders, and we are both super excited about the person that we have today. I will bring her on in just a moment, but it is Carrie Burd. She is a certified diversity and inclusion recruiter. She is a diversity think tank contributing writer, and she is a transformational HR leader. I tell you what, guys, we did a tech test yesterday, and Niatu and I were both thrilled with the amount of information that she had to share, and I can't wait to see that come to light today. So, without further ado, we will bring in Miss Carrie Burd. Hello, Carrie. How are you?
Hi, wonderful, Lezlie. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for being here.
My
Yeah, good
pleasure.
to
Thank
see
you
you.
for inviting me. Nice to see you, Niatu.
Yeah, it's great to have
So
you.
great. Yeah, it was wonderful hearing you, Lezlie, talk about your sort of first interactions with Niatu and saying how much you just liked him and wanted to work with him. I had exactly the same reaction. We actually met through a LinkedIn correspondence, and I was just thrilled with the content that he was putting out and the way he sort of thought and felt about things. And we really connected on that. So it's so nice to be here.
Yeah,
Yep.
thank you for accepting our request. And to everyone out there listening, Carrie left some incredibly insightful comments on my posts. I did one about inclusivity with hiring. I did one about the open to network hashtag as well, and the banner. And her feedback on those was amazing, and that was the reason she was my number one choice as who first on my list of who we wanted to bring on the show. And thankfully, she was available and said yes. And so here we are today. And so sit back, get a pen and paper, take some notes, because some gems will be dropped, and so you want to be able to catch those
Not
as we
to
go
set the
through
bar too
this.
high there.
Yeah, no pressure at all, right? No pressure at all. But I think just as Lezlie kicked it over to me to introduce myself, I want to do the same for you, Carrie. Would you kindly walk us through your background, let us understand how you got to where you are today? Why is DEI such a major passion focus for you throughout your career?
Sure. Yeah, so I've been really blessed. I've had a wonderful career over the last 20 odd years. I started out actually in the broader public sector and then moved into government proper. And my first foray into the D&I space was really when I was appointed to a role that was relatively new at the time. It was called an accessibility coordinator role. And my function in that role was to design a compliance and training plan to support our compliance with provincial legislation. So from there, it actually catapulted me into a number of HR roles and senior leadership roles. I've had some really interesting intersections with DEI along the way. It's always been sort of a strategic pillar or strategic focus of almost every job that I've had since then, including roles as Director of Accessibility Integration Planning. It was the inaugural role in the province of Ontario of that kind. And my mandate was to lead a multi-year development and planning process to integrate and align the province's economic development mandate with its accessibility mandate. Then I went on to have a role in as Director of Entrepreneurship. And in that role, I was leading the entrepreneurship pillar of programming for Ontario's youth job strategy, which was a 4-year, $565 million strategy. So I had about $100 million of programming in that. And it was really in service of helping youth shift from being job seekers to job creators. And it was targeted at underrepresented youth. So we were looking at Aboriginal youth, French-speaking youth, immigrant youth, newcomer youth, youth with disabilities, and racialized youth. So it was sort of a broad spectrum, but that was a really exciting job. And it really helped round out my HR practice to spend some time on the front lines of government and delivering programs to the people and be really on the ground. And talk with our stakeholders. And then I came back into the HR family, and I've had a number of different roles, including Director of Strategic Human Capital Planning, Director of Strategic HR, and Senior Manager of Talent Development. So it's been a really fun journey. And like I said, all along the way, DEI was always a strategic focus of mine. But I've really taken steps over the last couple of years to formalize my credentials in that space. So one of them, as you mentioned, is becoming a certified diversity and inclusion recruiter. The other is pursuing certification as a diversity professional, which I hope to have by the end of April. And I'm also rounding out my practice by studying to become a workplace wellness coach for some of the very same reasons that Niatu talked about, which is really dealing with the mental health aspects of DEI. So I see it as a very sort of complementary pursuit. So that's a little bit about me. In terms of why DEI is so important, I think it really is a matter of looking at sort of the moral, legal, ethical, and business case for diversity and inclusion. And I think we're really just not tapping into all the talent and the gifts that are available out there if we're not doing that. And I think we have a long way to go in terms of making it feel safe for everybody, especially all that's happened in the sort of social, political, and policing unrest that we've seen over the last year and a half now. So it's not work for the faint of heart, but it's work that I'm really passionate about for sure.
Awesome. Thank you for such an in-depth answer. Your journey has been a really interesting one that you've been able to straddle both the government side of things and the corporate side. So I think that gives you a relatively unique perspective that you can bring to our conversation today. And I really appreciate the last couple of things you said around companies sort of missing out on, talent because DEI is not well in place. And it's a miss for everybody, both on the employer side and on for the job seekers themselves. If that connection is not being made, we are losing the richness of what society has to offer if we don't focus on it properly. So I really appreciate that point you made.
Thank you.
Me too, Carrie. I really appreciate your passion for all of this. It's evident in the way you speak about it, and it's evident in all of the knowledge that you have already gained and that you are just continuing to push yourself to gain. I think that's amazing. Before we go any further, I just want to say hello to some people in the comments. Sarah has an excellent question. I'll bring that up in just a second. But first, I wanted to say hello to Tracy Phillips. Tracy Phillips is the video lady. She's the live video lady. She is the person that really has encouraged me and given me a lot of bravery to do these live things. So none of us would be here right now if it weren't for Tracy. So I wanted to say hello to her. And Sarah has a question for you that a couple of people have echoed already. So I thought it'd be good to get into that first, if it's okay with you guys. Sarah wants to know, what are your thoughts about recruiters or hiring managers who won't really talk to you unless you complete a bunch of online assessments? This is an obstacle I keep running into, she says. Carrie, do you have any thoughts on that? Just, I know I put you on the spot a little bit.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma. And I'll be the first to sort of cop to the fact that I've undergone the process to become accredited to deliver high potential assessments myself, and also emotional intelligence assessments. And I think one of the reasons for that is we know, none of us is perfect. We're all sort of like deeply flawed in our own way. And that as long as we have sort of a growth versus a fixed mindset, and we're willing to sort of continuously evolve ourselves and learn and develop, having a baseline of understanding can be really helpful to us. And I think what's happened is, normally in the context of sort of performance coaching in the workplace, we do these assessments to get that benchmark and then, or that baseline, and then help sort of grow our talent from there. But I think a lot of organizations are trying to de-risk the hiring process by administering those assessments up front and trying to leverage the insights from those assessments to determine whether or not you'd be a good cultural fit for the organization. We'll talk about cultural fit, I think, later on in the interview today, but I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to hedge their bets. And so I don't know that it's necessarily a choice if you're genuinely interested in the role and you want to pursue it. I think it's just one of those steps that you have to go through. But my hope for you as a job seeker is that the person who's administering the assessment is A, using the right tool, and B, is skilled and certified in their ability to sort of interpret the results, because they can be misused, and we want to hedge against that.
Right. Just on that point about the misuse piece, and Lezlie, and I'll let you get to the next question. I was watching a documentary on Netflix last night called Coded Bias, and it's about the bias inherent in algorithms and AI, because again, humans program the AI, we create the algorithms. And so if it's a non-diverse, if it's a homogenous group of people, white men who are coding these algorithms, things are going to be missed. And so if we place too much faith in these algorithms, they're defended as being neutral because it's math, but humans still created the math behind them. And so I'm wondering if it's still humans at this point who are interpreting these screening assessments, or is it AI that's interpreting these assessments? And if it's on the AI side, I'm a bit concerned, on either side, the bias, could be there. And so I'm wondering if people are being screened out, prematurely or unfairly by having to go through these assessments.
Yeah, there's a scientist named Nicole Turner who's actually done a lot of work on AI and bias, and she's talked about that very issue, that you typically have a number of data scientists that are experts in their field, but they're not social scientists. And so what we're looking for is the integration between data science and social science to make sure that we're really focused on the outcomes we're looking for. And so what can happen is if you're not clear on the outcomes you're looking for and the values, beliefs, and sort of preconceptions that you're building into and training your algorithm on, you can inadvertently deliver a negative result or a biased result. So that's something we definitely need to be aware of. In terms of ATS systems, which is the applicant tracking system that you're referring to, I hear mixed opinions about that. A lot of people say it's really just a digital filing cabinet, but there's still a human at the end of the day who's reviewing the resumes. So I think as much as we should focus on removing the bias in algorithms for AI or machine learning, we also need to focus on making sure the recruiters who are sifting through those digital file cabinets are also aware of their own personal biases and how that comes into play when they're doing applicant screening.
Right.
Yep.
That's a great segue into the next question that Lezlie has, I think.
Yep, definitely. Nia too, I did watch that this weekend as well, so I'm glad you brought it up. Also, Joylene says that Race After Technology talks about that concept as well. So if anybody's interested, that is another resource. And to those of you who are in the chat, we are going to do our best to get to some of your questions. We have a lot already planned to cover, so please be patient with us, but we will try to go back and forth and get to some questions. With that said, Carrie, let's see. There are a lot of conversations being had right now about the idea that the hiring process is broken. It's a conversation that I feel like has come up in every one of my interviews so far this year for Behind Hiring. And much of that concept sort of centers around the fact that the hiring process is fundamentally inequitable. So what do you feel are some of the top ways to make the hiring process more equitable?
I think it starts with taking a couple of steps back and looking taking a close look at sort of your job descriptions and your job ads. And then it's about the interview process. So you'll bear with me, I'll back it up a little bit and just say, when we look at job descriptions, one of the big things that I see in HR is inflated educational knowledge, skills, and experience requirements. And I actually saw something come up in the comments where somebody said, they're just sort of starting out, but the employer's looking for 3 years of experience. And we see this even in the DE&I space. It's like a lot of organizations woke up last summer and suddenly started to care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're looking for people with 7, 8, 10 years of experience. And we're just now seeing sort of an emergence of expertise in this area. I think there's a lot of people who may have studied it in school and been long-term experts, but applying that expertise in the workplace may be a relatively niche offering. And so expectations may be inflated in that regard. So I think taking a really honest look at your job descriptions and saying, is it necessary to have a degree to do this job? Clearly in the case of an engineer or a nurse or a lawyer or an accountant, certain degrees or designations are really valuable or they're necessary from an ethical perspective for the practice that they do. But in other cases, that's not necessarily the case. Experience may be equal to the formal education that they get. So I would offer up that option that it can be you either have a BA or a master's or equivalent experience. The other is, years of experience can be pretty arbitrary. I can tell you based on some of the roles that I've been in, it's like jumping into the fire. And, a year or two in those positions, I learned probably more in that year or two than I did in the 5 years previously in my career. So it really depends on the quality of the experience that you're having in that role and how far you're being stretched, because sometimes that can really deliver a lot of meaningful experience. The other is really looking at, is there gendered language in your job description? So are you inadvertently through your job description or your job ad appealing to a very narrow segment of the population? So for example, really easy one is like a journeyman, right? Or a lineman instead of a line person. Or, there's certain words that we use like power verbs, power words that are more attractive to females than they are to men. So it may be instantly off-putting. So if you're trying to diversify and bring, for example, more women in tech or more women in trades, you probably want to run your job ads through something like a gender-coded software to understand whether or not you're using gendered language. Then it's really about making sure that your entire interview process is standardized and that it's accessible. And so, I've offered you guys sort of a 12 tips on how to be more inclusive in your recruitment practices that you're welcome to share with your audience, that really walks in detail through what that process looks like. But I think it really starts with understanding what's the framework for your interview. What are the topics you're going to cover? What are the do's and don'ts from a legal perspective and an ethical perspective? And are your hiring managers trained to that interview guide? So can they provide a consistent candidate experience for everybody who comes in the door for an interview? Then once they're in the interview, you want to make sure that you have a diverse hiring panel so you can counter any biases that might exist within the hiring manager, but make sure that you don't promote consensus scoring. So you want each person, the value of their insights to come through in the scoring. And you want to make sure the questions are standardized, that you're asking every candidate the same question in the same order. And ideally, you're going to score them horizontally. And so if you're not familiar with that term score horizontally, what we're talking about is looking at, okay, let's score each candidate across question number 1. Let's score each candidate across question number 2. And the reason for that is that when you look sequentially through the questions, you could be using a halo or horn effect or a bias that cascades through the scoring of every question for that candidate. So it's helpful to take a step back and look across the candidate pool when you're doing your scoring. And it's really about making the candidate feel comfortable in the room. So making sure you're welcoming them in, that you give them an interview kind of like roadmap at the start. So here's what it's going to look like today. If I'm not looking at you a lot, I want you to understand the reason why I'm doing that is I'm taking notes. The reason why we take notes is so that we don't rely on memory after the interview, that we capture all sort of the juicy parts of what you're saying today, and that we can be as fair to everybody as possible. If at any point you want to stop and pause and ask to have a question repeated, or you want to take a few minutes to think for yourself, and before you provide your answer, don't be afraid of that pause time. Don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions. Like really just making sure everybody's comfortable. Tissue, Kleenex, like it's really the human elements of how you make somebody feel welcome and feel settled in the interview, and not to have overly big panels. I think that's unnecessary and can be really intimidating for candidates. So those are some of the key tips. I would say there's more in the checklist, but I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Great. For those of you watching, Andy put into the chat the resources that Carrie was mentioning. So she was kind enough to create 2 downloads for you guys to take away from this chat today. There are all kinds of excellent resources for DE&I and learning that you can do online. And then there are also, what was the other one, Carrie?
It was the 12 inclusive recruitment practices.
There we go. Perfect. So the link that Andy shared in the chat is good to download both of those. So feel free to take those away today. She did a wonderful job. They look really great, and I think they'll be super helpful.
Yeah, for sure. That was an absolute wealth of information that you shared in your first, large answer. And I really appreciate that last portion about, making people feel welcome in the interview process itself. This
Mhm.
next question will deal with a bit more the external communication process with candidates as they try to get in the door in the first place for an interview. And so job seekers have to jump through a lot of hoops, whether it's doing free work as far as doing some sort of, sample or test. They
Mhm.
have to have multiple rounds of interviews, even more now during COVID, because of the video interface. And they have all these hoops to jump through. And they, as I alluded to earlier, might feel like commodities in the process. You start talking about putting the human element back into the interview process in the room. What about outside of
Mhm.
the room? How can the communication process and the general candidate journey, if you like, become more
Mhm.
human-centered in your view?
Mhm. Well, I think it comes down to, very much like DEI work in general, it comes down to perspective taking, right? So, how do we put ourselves in the shoes of job seekers and interview candidates and understand what the journey might be like for them? So, if you picture, you're sitting outside of a company, you you may or may not have access to the org charts. You may or may not be able to see enough information on their website to understand who they are, what's important to them. So I think really making sure that you're leveraging your website to help candidates understand what it would be like to work for you. So, what's your workplace culture like? What do you value? What are your strategic priorities? Giving people enough meat on the bone to help them adequately prepare for the interview. Like, it shouldn't be a lot of guesswork. Um, asking for the moon in job descriptions is a common thing too. So, really keeping a tight focus in your job descriptions and your job ads on what are those essential must-have skills and what's the kind of stuff that you can learn on the job, or you can even take time to sort of study up on before you go into the interview. It's making sure that if you're trying to attract diverse talent, that it's easy for them to find you, that it's easy for people to go onto your website and say, yeah, there's pro-diversity statements in the job ad on their website. I understand how it connects into their strategic plan. I see how it's being measured. And really making sure that employees feel comfortable that they understand what they're getting into. I mean, I don't know sort of where or how you want to deal with this, but I think one of the things that really struck me as I read a LinkedIn post recently that, it's a helpful mind shift for job seekers to switch from seeing themselves as auditioning for a company and look at it more like a business meeting, that you're coming in and you're essentially hiring a job as opposed to being hired. And that just that mindset shift alone as a job seeker can be really empowering and really help sort of center you in the process. But from the employer side, it's all the things I think you already had started to touch on, Niatu, which is, be respectful of how much time it takes to interview, how much investment goes into preparing cover letters, customizing resumes, preparing for job interviews. Make sure that any sort of work samples you're asking for or test assignments that you give are really tied to the skills and competencies of the role, and they aren't actually asking for free consulting work. I mean, there's nothing worse as a job seeker than to invest hours and hours in developing a presentation to deliver at a job interview and not get the job, but you actually just gave away something that in another scenario might have been monetizable for you, right? That it's worth your time, money. They got free advice, they got a free roadmap. So really just you should be looking at it as this is just really confirmation or verification that they have the skills they say they have, and to be mindful of the time investment in that. I'm sure you guys, you're experts in your field. You probably have lots you can add to that, but I think those are some of the things I'd be thinking about.
I love that, Carrie, and I think it fits in. Everything you said there fits in really well with our mission of helping to empower job seekers. And that shift you talked about is so important, and it can change everything for a job seeker. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. That's fantastic. Okay, so we've talked. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something? Oh, no. Okay. We've talked a little bit about the employer side. Let's move on to a question about workplace culture. So this is something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and I'd like to talk to you and ask you if you think the concept of workplace culture impedes progress toward more equitable work environments. That's a conversation that's kind of being had. So I'm curious how you feel about that, and if you do think perhaps it impedes progress, how do you think it does that, and what are some of the possible solutions to help overcome that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that question's a bit of a minefield. Yeah, I think there's definitely been a trend we're seeing and shifting away from thinking about describing potential employees or employees as having a culture fit. And I think the emphasis is being shifted towards, is there a values fit? And I think that makes sense for me. Because workplace culture is really a combination of a number of different elements. So it's sort of, how are the leaders at the top behaving? It's your belief systems, it's the values, it's what's recognized, it's what's rewarded, it's what's ignored, it's what's said and unsaid. And it's really how power is structured and used in the organization. So it has a deep effect on sort of the emotional and relational sort of environment for the employee. And what we know is that organizations that have a really strong culture sometimes also have a very closed culture, that it's almost exclusionary by its very nature. And so in a world that's increasingly more diverse, how do you make that culture more open and safe and accepting, and leaving people operating inside that culture feel like they belong? That's a really big challenge, but I think it starts with an awareness of what are your own sort of belief systems and values, and how do they affect the way you think and behave and the actions that you take? And how might somebody else's perspective differ from yours, or their lived experience differ from yours, and therefore affect the way they experience the culture? So just some really quick examples, and these would be familiar, I'm sure, to all of your listeners, is, what if you have an employee who is a recovering alcoholic, or you have an employee based on religious beliefs who won't engage in the consumption of alcohol, or can't engage in the consumption of alcohol, but you build your team building around going to the bar every Friday night for pub night. That's challenging, because you've automatically excluded people with children and daycare pickup times and elder care responsibilities, people who don't drink, people who may be recovering from addictions or alcohol. What do you do if you book an event and it has no elevator? The only way to get into the building is with stairs, and you have an employee who uses a wheelchair. How do they access the venue? And I have to say, that issue has come up a number of times in my career. There was one gentleman who sort of traveled with me throughout my career in government, where it didn't matter how long he was with us and how many times we got it wrong, there was always something that got in the way of his full participation. Having rigid start and end times. If you have an employee who, for example, requires access to Wheel-Trans, and that's a Canadian term, I don't know if you have it where you are, if it's sort of understood with that name, but it's basically a company that provides transportation for people with wheelchairs, and you can book it like you can book a taxi, but it's on pretty rigid times, because they're usually picking up more than one customer at a time. So it's almost like the Uber of wheelchair users. And so if you have really fixed and rigid start and end times, or you're not respectful about ending meetings on time, the person who relies on Wheel-Trans can really suffer. So they may, it may cause them to have to say no to a job. They might miss their ride home if you keep them late at a meeting, or they miss out on the meeting. So just being really respectful of that. It's looking at the diversity calendar, understanding that most of our holidays are structured around the Christian belief system. And so how does that impact your employees who are Muslim or Jewish or Hindu, and making sure that you recognize the celebrations, so we can unintentionally be exclusive in how we operate and build our culture. So it's looking at how do we make it more welcoming and inclusive for everybody.
I really love that values piece. I think something that Leslie and I both really lean into in the content that we put out. And we are constantly encouraging job seekers to really lead with their values in their job search. And so, number one, clarifying what's most important to you, whether it is having a job that has flexible hours so that you can attend to your duties at home, whether that's children or that is older parents, or a workplace that is supportive. If diversity is something that's important to you, what are they doing in that realm? And so by you sharing that, if there's a values alignment as a way for both the employer and the job seeker to find a match, that sounds much healthier than a workplace culture, which can be so many different things, especially as the example that you put there. And it's a very quick way to leave people out if the main focus is culture X, whatever that might be, versus a values approach. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and you know what, Joyce Odidison, who is my trainer for my wellness coaching program. You know, she's a brilliant woman, and she's very knowledgeable in her field. And one of the interesting exercises we've just gone through is talking about values. And I found it very interesting that she was saying that a lot of people actually aren't really in touch with what their values are, and that it's worthwhile to take time to sit back and reflect on that and really distinguish between what she calls your primary or your core values and your secondary values. And I think the best way to explain that, because I think the source of a lot of values conflict actually comes from the second group of values, which is your secondary values. So she talks about thinking about it almost from the perspective of what are my deal breakers. So your core values are, I value work-life balance, I value my family, I value honesty, integrity. But then there's these sort of like values that sit below the waterline on your values iceberg, which, you know, you may only become aware of your values if you come into conflict with somebody else's values or another person, right? So really thinking through, you know, for example, for somebody, it might be, you know, they might not consider justice as one of their values, but they're sitting out there reacting to what's happening in policing with Black men right now. And all of a sudden, they're becoming acutely aware of the values they hold around justice and equity. So, you know, thinking through those kinds of things to really understand what would be a deal breaker for me in the workplace. And so I have to be aware not only of the sort of aspirational or core values, but also these things that could really affect me if I were to encounter somebody who didn't share my values. And then how do you adjust your behavior, expectations, or your belief systems to accommodate that? Because we're not all going to share the same values.
Right. I think both Leslie and I would encourage job seekers to generate questions for employers based on your values. And so you can ask them, you know, what have they done in support of the current social justice climate as a way to screen out if this company aligns with your own personal values in this area, as an example.
Right. And I mean, we talk about this a lot in the DEI space too, about sort of performative DEI work or performative allyship. And so I think it behooves job seekers, especially those who are looking for pro-diversity employees, to really dig a little bit deeper on that. That it, you know, having pro-diversity statements on your website doesn't necessarily drive better outcomes. There's a lot of studies that prove that. But it's really sort of the deeper work they do. It's the difficult conversations they're prepared to have. It's the systems and process they're prepared to sort of deconstruct and rebuild that really matter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Diversity
I really
statements
appreciate.
are easy. The work is hard.
It is.
Yep.
It's not fast. It's not easy.
I appreciate all of that you said. I love that you mentioned that values are sometimes hard to identify, and it takes some interactions with other people or situations that are maybe outside of what you're used to enlighten yourself about what your values are. I think that's been true for me at times in life, and it's definitely something I find when I work with career changers on some coaching to help them dig into all of that. It's often things that they're like, you know, these are all true things that I found out about myself, but I had never really sat down and thought about that or knew that about myself. So I love that you mentioned that. And then I think this conversation really leads well into the next question. So we've talked about, you've touched on empowerment, Carrie, and then Nia too, you just mentioned about, job seekers asking questions throughout the process to make sure that the values alignment is really there. So Carrie, what other ways do you think job seekers can empower themselves when it comes to selecting companies to work for that are more focused on inclusion and diversity?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great question. I think, when I was going through my certification process to become a diversity and inclusion recruiter, one of the exercises that we had was to go out and sort of sample or audit a number of websites to find out how easy it was to find out diversity and inclusion information. And it was surprisingly hard. That I looked at a whole bunch of websites, and very few people have actually surfaced DEI sort of front and center, or even in some kind of relatively prominent position on their website. So as a job seeker, it would be really challenging, I think, to find companies that will have a values alignment with that. So I think first and foremost, it would be as a communications expert or the CEO of a company, is to look at what are we projecting out into the world via our website about how we think about DEI, anti-racism, anti-oppression, feminism, and what are we saying about that. So make it easy for job seekers to find that information on your website. The other is to make sure that you're going past the performative nature of DEI and that you're really sort of where you can. And I know it's hard work and it takes resources, but to really try to move the yardstick in DEI and not just say the nice things or have the pretty website, but actually take concrete action towards addressing the barriers for people that are underrepresented in the workforce right now. The other is, as a leader, it's to really diversify your networks to make sure, a lot of us, there's been some interesting studies done on when you look across your networks, most of us will find most of the people in our network look like us, sound like us, talk like us, may come from the same places, maybe working in a similar field. And if 70 to 80% of jobs are found through networking, we're really limiting the talent pool just because we've limited our networking. So making sure to really stretch your networks. But again, that's on the employer side. So on the job seeker side, it's looking for employers that have those diversity things and really asking sort of deeper questions when you have the opportunity, either in the initial screening or in the interview process, to understand, what do past and current employees say about them on websites like Glassdoor? Do they have supply chain diversity agreements? Are they working with minority-owned businesses? What are their suppliers and partners saying about them? Are they involved in any community partnerships or organization that are helping to advance the cause of anti-racism and DEI? Are they actually making commitments that they're measuring, tracking, and reporting on as it relates to DEI? And you can ask for specifics, like, if they've said they've made a commitment to diversifying their workforce, how diverse is it right now? What percentage of, Black women have received promotions in the last 3 years? So there's a number of ways that you can sort of dig deep into it to better understand how diverse the employer is.
Right, and you brought up something really interesting yesterday. We're both so excited to get in, aren't we? Where you mentioned how diverse candidates, especially BIPOC candidates, sometimes engage in the practice of whitewashing their resume. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, that would be someone who, so my name is Niatu Benciential. Maybe if I became Nathan Benciential, that would be me whitewashing my resume to try and overcome any potential hurdles or bias based on just my name alone. And you had shared a really interesting point that turned my thinking on it. We do know that this tactic works. We've seen studies that show that if Joe and Jose with the exact same resume apply, Joe will get twice the callbacks as Jose with the exact same resume information. But Carrie brought up a wonderful point for job seekers to realize that by using your own name, by not whitewashing your name, you're empowering yourself to potentially screen out employers who are discriminatory, who are biased, because they're not giving you a call back, even though you're very well qualified. And so ultimately, you wouldn't want to work there anyway. And so you might have avoided, a minefield, a toxic environment by just being who you are and showing up as your full authentic self, in the application process. And so I thought that was a really great tip you shared.
Yeah, and I think, there's sort of a bit of a double bind there, right? So one of
Hmm.
the other parts of the study is that in the process of whitewashing your resume, or whitening your resume, which can go beyond sort of anglicizing your name, it can include removing any references to affinity groups that you might be a part of or political
Right.
causes you might be supporting. And what happens is for underrepresented candidates who do that, they are essentially stripping away a lot of really valuable human capital experience. And so then when they go and sort of apply up against a white candidate, they actually look like they have less experience than the white candidate because they've stripped that out. So some ways people get around it is to just, again, sort of remove any references that might be attached to a stigmatized identity, but they still include the nature of the work or the experience they did. But as you've raised, Niatu, is that I think you may be doing yourself a disservice if you do that. You're making yourself harder to find as an underrepresented talent, and you're also losing an opportunity to weed out discriminatory employers. So it's a personal decision, a deeply personal decision, but yeah, there's definitely some pros and cons to that.
I'm really grateful that you guys brought that up. I think that's a really important thing to touch on and to let people know about. Carrie, real quickly, just before we move off of this question, you mentioned asking some questions of the hiring manager or in the interviewing process or what have you. And I know that Niatu and I both are big proponents of that. Some of the questions that you mentioned are, like you said, pretty deep. You dig pretty deep and ask these questions. And I can imagine there may be some job seekers sitting there going, wow, that seems like a pretty a forward question, maybe kind of aggressive. Do you either have any advice for people like that, or can you say anything about how those types of questions are perceived by employers to help job seekers just really prepare themselves as much as possible if they decide to go that route?
Yeah, I think you definitely run the risk of seeming to be sort of more demanding or more aggressive in that line of questioning. But I think you may be relatively safer off asking those questions if they've already put pro-diversity statements on their website. So if you just, I think it's a matter of anchoring it back in both your interest in the company and the skills that you have to offer. So let's say you're applying for a job to become a purchaser and you're really interested in DEI. So, I'm really interested in working for your company. I love what you're all about. As a purchaser, I'll have an opportunity to buy goods and services from a number of different vendors. Do you have a supply chain diversity policy? Do you have any kind of commitment to working with minority-owned businesses? Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Or, if that, I know that there's sort of, how do I describe it? Even in the context of sort of employee engagement, you could ask questions about, employee engagement in large part is grounded in how safe and engaged people are, how they feel included or their sense of belonging. How do you measure for aspects of diversity and employee engagement survey? Can you tell me a little bit about that? Or if they've made the commitments and it's posted on their website or in their strategic plan, it's making a direct line to that. So I think it really depends on each situation. I don't think I can give any blanket advice about that, but I think it's really about, like in any interview, it's about doing your homework. So really looking for the opening. I don't think I would just go into an interview, answer the standard sort of 5 or 6 questions that they pose to you, and then going cold into, tell me, what are your stats about diversity? It's really looking for the connection to the storytelling you need to do or want to do about yourself and your skills and your passion for the job and the work, and leveraging what you know and learn through your research about the company. I think a company that's genuinely interested in diversity, who's working hard to reach diverse candidates, is going to appreciate the fact that somebody went on their website, they looked at the organizations or the tables that their CEO or CHRO sits at and where they're making those sort of public commitments, and they've come in and they've been expressed an interest in that. Because I think even underrepresented employees still have their own work to do, because we're all we all arrive in life with biases that we're constantly fighting. And so we need everybody, as Niatu said at the beginning, to be part of that DE&I journey. So that would be sort of a bonus for me as a recruiter to see that somebody had taken the time to learn about what we were doing and to ask thoughtful questions.
That's awesome. So basically you're saying it's another kind of part of the screening process. If that's truly important to you, then bring it up. And if it makes them uncomfortable, then maybe that's not the right company.
Correct. Yeah.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
Before we get into the next question, Laura Fernandez put a great question in the chat. She says, I had a job interview last week. It was for a planning position. And one of the questions was, how would you integrate D&I into your job? I didn't know how to answer. I usually think of D&I as a broad company policy, not sure how to break it down into individual contribution is what the last part of that is. Do you have any advice or thoughts on a question like that?
That's a great question. I think it would really start with, again, going back to sort of examining your own beliefs and values and understanding your communication preferences, your working style, and looking for opportunities to leverage your position or the power that you have to actually not only share power where you can, but also to invite input where you can. So as an individual contributor, let's say, you're the kind of person where you pick up a project, you like to dig deep, take it, run with it, but you come into that project with a certain perspective, a certain lens, and you may not be taking into account other people's positions or needs or perspectives. And so looking across your team and inviting input from unexpected sources can really help enrich your project and deliver ultimately a better solution, because you've actually helped co-define the business challenge and you've co-created the solution to address it. So I think it's really just about living and operating in the value of inclusivity in your day-to-day work. And I think it's also a matter of just becoming really informed as an individual contributor about your own bias, understanding about different religions, different ethnicities, understanding about, different family status, that not everybody who's married is, heterosexual, not everybody who is a parent. And of those who are parents, not everyone has, children that are biologically related to them. They may be adopted children or foster children. So it's really looking across the diversity that exists in the workplace and making sure you have sort of a baseline of understanding about what that looks like, and that you're not operating from a sort of a very narrow cast view.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And the way I'm internalizing that is checking in with other people about what works best for them by asking simple questions and co-creating and co-defining whatever it is you're working on. Something I've learned to do recently is practice, I'll call it Zoom inclusivity. So I'll ask someone, hey, how do you best pay attention on Zoom? It's okay if you need to look away. Should I share my screen so you're not looking in multiple places? What works best for you for us to have this interaction? And that's Zoom inclusivity that I try to practice. Yeah. And that can be done in so many ways within your individual job, just asking how people would work best and finding compromise between the two of you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And so furthering the conversation about DEI, you and I think, are enrolled in the same course at the University of South Florida for that DEI certification. And I was really hit hard in the first class where we focused on emotional intelligence. And so I've been focused for a while on the empathy gap as being a major challenge to us making progress in social justice, in equity, and all of that work. And then I got hit with emotional intelligence being like the foundation of DEI. I just want to get your take on that. How do you see the connection between emotional intelligence and DEI taking place in the corporate setting or just the business setting in general and moving the agenda forward?
So I think, maybe we just start by sort of unpacking a little bit those two terms. So, when I think of empathy, I think it's more about feeling. So am I able to feel what other people feel? So for example, if you're watching a sad movie and you cry, you have empathy because you can feel what the characters are feeling in the movie. You know, when your child gets sick or they hurt themselves and it, you know, your stomach drops, your heart's pounding and you're feeling their pain, that's empathy. But emotional intelligence is more about awareness and thinking, and it sort of consolidates or solidifies the empathy. So it allows you to smartly use what you feel. So the idea is that with emotional intelligence, I understand my own emotions and I understand the emotions of others, and I know how to manage them effectively. Mm-hmm. So the connection to my mind with DE&I is if you lack empathy, you don't feel for others. And if you lack emotional intelligence, you don't know what to do with that feeling if you feel it. And if you don't feel it, you're sort of operating blindly without understanding other people's needs and desires. And so emotional intelligence and empathy are really foundational, I think, leadership competencies. I think everybody needs them and everybody works better with other people when they have them, but it's particularly important for leaders. So as somebody who's involved in emotional intelligence assessments, you know, I really see the value of that, but I would encourage every organization to really think about how the absence of empathy or emotional DE&I would make it nearly impossible for a leader in today's world to really lead a diverse team. Because if they're not aware of their own emotions, they're not aware of their own biases, they can't put themselves in another person's shoes, they can't empathize with others, they're going to have a really hard time dealing with the differences, and they're going to have a super hard time dealing with the sort of the racial-based trauma and stress that's being experienced in the workplace right now. I think there's two sort of emerging issues over the last year that are really calling to attention this issue of empathy and emotional intelligence. It's the racial-based trauma, and it's quite frankly how COVID-19 is impacting people. But I think, you know, we're seeing a huge spike in the number of women and children who are being impacted by domestic violence at the hands of an intimate partner or a parent because of the forced isolation of COVID-19. We're seeing a lot of parents having to wear multiple hats and be a worker, a teacher, a parent, they're raising a pet, whatever they're doing. So you really need people, leaders in particular, with high empathy and emotional intelligence to be able to deal with all that complexity.
Yeah, beautifully stated, and I appreciate you breaking down and operationalizing those different definitions. I love to use the dictionary in my post and then break things down. And the emotional intelligence piece is it sounds like marshaling your emotions and deploying them effectively in terms of how you interact with others and being able to support what will be complex in pushing these initiatives forward. And if you're unable to support that, because dealing with DE&I can be very uncomfortable, because people have to realize, for example, in grad school, I had to contend with the fact that by being male, I'm sexist, not because I believe in it or practice it, but I benefit from male privilege just by being in this body and identifying, as I'm a cisgendered male. And so these can be very uncomfortable things. They can challenge identity, and that can make moving forward with DE&I very difficult. And so having the capacity, emotional capacity to work with that for yourself and for others is super important, and will enable us to be successful to move forward together versus forcing it on people or not being understanding when people are having a challenge with embracing what they're being asked to do.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well said. Yeah.
Thanks.
I love this conversation. I know we are running up against a little bit of time. We have a few more really strong questions. So I hope everyone will stick with us. And just to let you guys know, I think that Carrie will be sharing some more resources here at the end. So if you can stick with us, you'll get even more great resources. And with that, I think Nia2 had another question.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that is endlessly frustrating for me is hearing corporate leaders saying that they can't find diverse talent. It's becoming a really tired refrain when they're asked about diversity and recruitment, in the recruitment process. They can't find enough diverse candidates. How do you respond to this line that is offered up, and how do you advise leaders, who might think or feel this way, how to best move forward?
So I'll keep it short and sweet because I'm cognizant of the time, but I think we all know that's not true. in most places. So the obvious caveat is if you're in a densely populated urban center, we know there tends to be a lot more diversity there, and it's a lot easier for employers to access that diversity. If you're in a more rural area, it may be very difficult for you to diversify your workforce, either because of technical specifications for the job that are very niche, or because you simply don't have access to the diversity in the communities you're in. I think remote work opens new possibilities around that for a lot of people. So I would say, to companies to make sure that your recruiters have the skills and the ability to access diverse talent pools. So opening up new sourcing channels. So looking at community partnerships, looking at partnering with colleges and universities, intentionally looking for and identifying affinity-based organizations and using that as search criteria to be able to identify potential candidates through LinkedIn or other places based on their affinity. There's all kinds of tips and tricks. Tips and tricks for how to access diverse talent. You just have to be aware that that's your objective, and then have the support of a few of these little opportunities. So diversify your networks, improve the quality and the diversity of your referrals, use these tricks to access diverse talent pools, and make a conscious choice to create valued partnerships. I think those are the three main tips I would say.
Awesome. Yeah. Conscious
Excellent.
choice. Let's roll with that.
Okay, Carrie, just a couple more questions. One thing I do want to say to everyone watching, it looks like several people have mentioned that they really appreciate the conversation. We've got thanks, Carrie, Nia2, and Lezlie, really love the conversation. We've had several people say really appreciate this dialogue. Thanks so much, Carrie. If you guys are appreciating this, be sure you find and connect with Carrie on LinkedIn. At the end of the video, I'll have her information up to make it easy for you, but also you can probably just search Carrie Burd, B-U-R-D, and you'll find her there. Be sure to connect with her. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Okay, Carrie, if you could wake up tomorrow and the one thing that you feel is really broken in the hiring process was fixed, what would that be?
I would say fundamentally it's trying to extract the bias from the hiring process. I think that really makes a difference. I think, how we bring people in and how we augment our existing workforce really matters. And I think the best way to do that is probably tackling the issue of unconscious bias. So I know there's been a lot of training efforts around that, and people are concerned that it's not actually moving the needle. That may be true from a workplace culture perspective, and I think there are better ways to move the needle inside the organization, but in terms of accessing diverse talent and bringing them in the door, you really need to tackle the bias that's attached to the recruitment process and the lack of inclusivity there. And then once they're in the organization, you have to equip your leaders and your workers to actually deal with the diversity that you've introduced. And I think that gets back to the leadership competencies piece. So I'd place my money on trying to improve the inclusivity of the recruitment process.
That's really great. One thing that Carrie shared with me, I'll say this very briefly in one of the posts that I wrote, was giving job candidates the questions maybe 15 to 30 minutes ahead of time that they're going to be asked. This really levels the playing field and makes sure that people who are, maybe they're introverted, maybe they need a bit more time to process, that they get a fair shake in the interview situation versus those who are just excellent talkers and they can talk their way out of anything. And so that can really make things a bit more inclusive. Last couple of questions for you, Carrie, and then we'll let you go and release you to the rest of the day. So if you could reveal one employer insider secret to job seekers that might help them, get hired faster or just get hired in general, what might that be?
So I think the standard advice of network is still really valuable, and making sure that you're prepared if you don't get those questions in advance with your source story. So what was the situation? What was the obstacle? What was the action you took, and what were your results? So your source story. So make sure you have sort of a really solid set of stories that you can share in the interview process. But in terms of insider tips, I would really say that it has to do with most job specs are inflated. that these are wish lists for recruiters and hiring managers, and you're never going to get the candidate who has 100% of what you're looking for. So take a chance. Don't count yourself out from the start, especially women. We know from studies that we've looked at that men will typically apply for jobs where they meet 60% of the qualifications. Most women will hold back until they think they meet closer to 100%. But there's a new study out there that came out in about 2018 that suggests that the sweet spot is 50 to 60%. That after 60%, it's actually, you see diminishing returns in terms of requests for interview after that. So boy, if we only needed to meet 50 or 60% of the qualifications to get an interview, why wouldn't we throw our hat in the ring? Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be still looking for that alignment of your knowledge, skills, abilities, and experiences, and that you don't consider sort of the beliefs and value systems and whether or not there's an alignment there. But certainly don't discount yourself from the start. Recognize that there is inflation happening in the job requirements and throw your hat in the ring.
That's wonderful advice and encouragement. I'm going to just quickly highlight something you said earlier about the job seeker going into it like a business meeting and they're trying to hire a job, not just that they're being hired. I want to underscore that as a big takeaway. And then secondly, don't prematurely foreclose or count yourself out of an opportunity. If you meet at least 50, 60%, go ahead and apply and give yourself a shot. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? That old phrase. So we want to encourage all of you out there to, really give it a good go. You've all seen really mediocre people in really high positions. You can decide who that person is for you. So if you know you're qualified, go ahead and put your hat in the ring. Here's our final. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I saw a comment come up earlier too about the 3 years experience. And I think one point I would add to that is just where you don't meet 50% or 60% of the requirements exactly. I think it's worthwhile digging back and looking at what you did in school, what you do in your community, what you're doing on a volunteer basis, if you're running your own business, or even as sort of the chief of your household. What are you doing that has created a set of transferable skills for you, and how can you use those to help the employer see a match between what they're asking for and what you have to offer?
Yeah, another spin on that is I read this stat somewhere that about maybe just under 40% of the time, the most qualified person on paper gets the job. So that means 60% of the time, someone who's not the most qualified on paper is walking with the job offer. So can you show up, be your full authentic self, and demonstrate that you are what they didn't even know they're looking for? That's where the magic can happen in the job search process. And the fact that these job descriptions are inflated and not quite, on point for what they're actually looking for. So I hope that, encourages all of you out there. Final question.
I was just going to add
go ahead.
one quick thing too, because I think it's worth mentioning, especially when we talk about the obligation of the employer and the hiring manager. And it's very much related to what you were saying. There was a University of Texas medical school study where they actually they had a class of students that they had applied, that they picked, that was about 150 strong. But the government determined that there was going to be a shortage of doctors. So they went back to the University of Texas and asked them to increase the number to 200. So they went back to the reject pile and gathered up another 50 students and brought them into the pool to take it to 200. Years later, when they looked back at what became sort of a real-time field study of what happens to people who are, either accepted or rejected through the interview process, they discovered that the performance between the two groups was identical. And that when they looked to sort of unpack what accounted then for why they got rejected in the first place, 75% was based on interviewer perception and had nothing to do with the candidate. So again, that's just something, for anybody who's sort of on the call listening from the perspective of a recruiter, is to really think about what you can do to help your hiring managers and help yourself address those perception and sort of biases that you might have.
Right. Oh gosh, we could go on forever with this. Just look at your, no, this is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Because I just read something about passion being a very Western oriented viewpoint as a way to measure, someone's potential in doing a job or being admitted to school. At least I'm going to butcher her name. Sorry, but so another career coach shared this article. And so looking, what is your cultural orientation? What's your mindset? What are your values? You're interviewing from those. And so try to broaden those. And again, be inclusive. So you're not missing people who might not show up the same way that you do is what we're really trying to emphasize here. And so to round things off, would you kindly provide to anyone listening who'd like to do their own personal exploration about DEI, what resources might you recommend, either through formal or informal channels that people can check out beyond what you've, shared in the written list?
Sure. So I think, for everybody, it starts usually with some kind of reading. So I didn't include a book reading list in the resources that I've shared with you that you can pass on to your readers, but I'm certainly open to anybody who wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to provide my personal recommended reading list to you to help you on your journey. But I think there's tons of free courses out there. Don't let money be the thing that holds you back. I've included in the list of free resources a number of open line courses, MOCC courses that you can take through Udemy, Coursera, a number of different places like that, edX. There are some fabulous organizations. I probably haven't done it nearly enough justice with the ones I've listed, but it's a starting point. I've included specific resources for anti-Black racism, anti-Yappy racism, LGBTQ positivity and allyship resources, and then some generic DEI resources that you can look for and some online learning, and then reach out to me if you want a recommended book reading list.
All right, awesome.
That is awesome. I had Andy put that link into the chat again, so it's in there twice, just most recently. Also, I just want to share, Amy says, great info on inflated job descriptions. Thank you so much. I believe the name is Chavi. I'm so sorry if I did not pronounce it correct, but Chavi says, feeling motivated. Kazanthi says, great points, Carrie. And also love the questions and the answers to assist job seekers. This has been fantastic. Carrie, did you want to let people know where they can find or connect with you? I know you mentioned LinkedIn.
Yep, my email address is Carrie, Carrie.Burd, BURD, @gmail.com. And you can reach me on LinkedIn through in messaging or direct messaging. So feel free to reach out.
That is awesome. Niatu, did you have anything else that you wanted to say before we let Carrie go about her day?
I'm just super excited. This was a lot of fun. I hope all of you listening enjoyed this conversation. We're going to bring the same energy every time. I can promise you that. And we're just really blessed to have Carrie on as the first guest in this new format for us. And so thank you for bringing your knowledge, your passion, your incredibly detailed and nuanced answers. That is highly appreciated. And we hope that everyone out there got some great takeaways to implement at a personal level, at an organizational level. We hope some leaders are listening in as well. And again, this is on all of us, DEI, and all of us have the ability to impact the hiring process. Job seekers, you're empowered. Ask the questions that you need to make sure it's a good fit for you. And employers will respond if you start asking challenging questions, and enough of us start doing it. And employers, let's lead with the emotional intelligence and really start to push these things forward because they matter for all of us. It impacts us all. So I guess that's my wrap up message.
Yeah, thank you both so much for having me. This was such a pleasure. Really enjoyed talking with you, and it's great to see all the wonderful questions too from your listeners.
Yes, this has been fantastic. Carrie, we're going to go ahead and let you go. Thank you again. Niatu and I will hang on for just another minute and give some info about the next session. But thank you so much, Carrie.
Wonderful.
Really appreciate
Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Carrie.
day. Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Oh, switches. There we go. All right. Niatu, thank you so much. That was a blast. I think that conversation went really well. For everyone who is watching or listening, this will be every month, the second Tuesday of the month. Niatu and I will be together to interview with other hiring insiders. We are very excited. We're already talking about the next people that we want to bring in for future months. If you all have any questions or particular people that you like and admire and who sort of align with our mission, please feel free to reach out to either or both of us and let us know. I know for me personally, I'm always open to learning about new people and meeting new people who can bring value to the conversation. When we get done, you will see information for Carrie and Nia2 and myself on our end screen. So be sure that you are connecting with all of us and always reach out. Let us know what we can do for you, because that is what we are here for. Nia2, anything else?
No, I think you covered it all with the technical follow-up and next steps. We hope that all of you found value in what we did today. Please come back and see us again the second Tuesday of every month. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, what we're trying to do here. And hopefully we can create a movement and have all of you come on board and, allow us to continue doing this. We're here because of you. And so we appreciate any and all support.
Yes, hashtag behind hiring. That is the hashtag for this series. So you can share that with your friends and family as well and make sure we get folks following that. Okay, I think that's everything. I am thrilled. Thank you all for being here. If you haven't yet, go ahead and give us a like, leave us a comment, share it so that other people can see it. I will be with you for Career Tip Tuesday next week, and Nia2 and I will be together in a month for the second Tuesday of the month. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Bye, everybody.